The Freetown State Forest does not breathe. It waits. Here, the fog clings to the earth, a thick, gray shroud that swallows sound before it can travel more than a few feet. For decades, the locals have walked the perimeter and whispered the same warnings. Do not trust the horizon. Shadows here possess a life of their own, detaching from the trees to drift against the direction of the light. Paths that appear straight for miles suddenly loop back upon themselves, guiding travelers to the exact point where they began. It is a place of deceptive silence. No birds call from the high canopy. No wind rustles the needles. The stillness is not an absence of life, but a calculated pause, as if the entire expanse is holding its breath. Every inch of the damp, moss-covered ground is marked by the history of those who entered and never found the exit. The air feels heavy, pressurized, as though the forest itself is leaning in to watch. You can walk for hours, convinced you are moving forward, only to find the same twisted roots and jagged rocks you passed at dawn. The forest is a circuit, and it is hungry for those who still believe they can find their way out. Autumn of 2023. Elsa Vivian crossed the tree line, leaving behind a life that had finally collapsed into ash. She sought the silence of the woods to bury the noise of her past, but the forest offered no solace. The air here carried a distinct, cloying weight, the scent of damp rot and stagnant earth. She moved with a desperate, rigid precision, her boots crushing brittle leaves that crackled like bone under her weight. Every step felt measured against the oppressive stillness. She scanned the horizon for a landmark, but the fog distorted distances, turning distant trunks into looming, shapeless sentinels. She stopped to catch her breath, pressing her palm against the rough, cold bark of a hemlock. The wood was slick with moisture. Then, the scent deepened, turning metallic and sharp. Elsa straightened, her gaze darting into the gray haze. The silence was no longer empty. It felt occupied. She listened, straining against the absolute lack of wind, until the wet, rhythmic sound of something dragging through the undergrowth reached her ears. She was not alone. The isolation she had traveled miles to find was a lie, and the nightmare was already beginning to close its circle around her. Elsa pushed forward, the canopy above knitting together into a ceiling of suffocating density. She kept her eyes low, tracking the path, but the ground was treacherous. Roots snaked upward, tripping her stride. She stumbled, hands hitting the wet mulch, and froze. Beneath her palms, the soil felt uneven. She brushed away a layer of decaying pine needles to reveal a rusted metal buckle, half buried and caked in grime. It was not a natural debris. She stood, her pulse hammering against her ribs, and scanned the gloom. To her left, a patch of ferns had been trampled flat. The mud showed distinct, irregular indentations, not the print of a boot, but the drag of something heavy and uncoordinated. She followed the trail with her eyes. 10 yards ahead, a heap of discarded scraps lay piled against the base of an ancient oak. It was a collection of personal belongings, cracked frames, single shoes, and torn fabrics, all bleached by the perpetual damp. These were the hollowed-out remains of those who had come before. The realization settled in her gut like lead. The woods were not just a landscape. They were a graveyard that refused to let its contents rest. She started to walk again, faster now, but the clicking of dry branches in the distance answered her every move. The clicking intensified, a rhythmic chattering that seemed to vibrate through the very air she breathed. Elsa broke into a run, her boots hammering against the soft, rotting earth. The forest was narrowing, the trees pressing in until the path became a claustrophobic tunnel of shadow. She ducked under a low-hanging branch, the wet wood scraping against her shoulder, and scrambled up a steep, muddy ridge. Her lungs burned with the cold, damp air. She reached the crest and stopped, turning back to scan the gloom. Nothing moved, yet the sense of being followed was absolute. She forced herself to look ahead, desperate for any break in the wall of pines. Then, she saw it. A faint, flickering orange light pierced the dense fog, barely a pinprick in the overwhelming gray. She pushed through a thicket of thorns, ignoring the bite of the needles against her skin. The light grew, resolving into the outline of a structure. It was a log cabin, hunkered low into the hillside, its timber darkened by decades of rain. The roof sagged under the weight of moss, and the windows were boarded tight, yet the small, warm glow from within acted as a singular, magnetic beacon. It was the only solid thing in a world that had turned to fluid nightmare. The cabin stood silent, but the air around it felt charged. Elsa approached the porch, the wood groaning beneath her weight. She raised a hand to knock, but the door creaked open before she made contact. A man stood in the threshold. He was lean, his frame etched by years of harsh living and isolation. This was Elias. He did not step aside. Instead, he gripped the edge of the door frame, his knuckles white and calloused. He moved with a precision that betrayed a lifetime of tactical discipline. Inside, the room was dim, illuminated only by a single lantern hanging from a central beam. On a scarred wooden table near the hearth, a shotgun rested. Elsa caught the glint of the barrel, then the dull, heavy sheen of the shells laid out in a perfect row beside it. He picked one up, his thumb tracing the casing. The tip was not lead, but a polished, distinct silver. He slid it into the chamber with a sharp, metallic click that echoed in the small space. Elias looked past her into the darkness of the trees, his jaw set in a hard, unbreakable line. He knew exactly what was creeping through the fog, and he had been waiting for them for a long time. Elsa stumbled onto the porch, her legs failing as she hit the rough timber. She tried to rise, but her hands shook so violently she could only grip the edge of the doorframe. Every muscle in her body burned with the exertion of the run. She turned back toward the tree line, chest heaving in shallow, ragged gasps. The silence of the forest was punctured by a sudden, sharp snapping of branches. Somewhere in the deep dark, something was closing the gap. Elsa pressed her back against the cabin wall, her breathing ragged, eyes fixed on the shifting mist where the shadows seemed to pulse with movement. A distant, rhythmic clicking sound drifted toward her, clearer and more frantic than before. She let out a choked gasp, pushing herself up with raw, scraped palms. Elias did not hesitate. He grabbed her shoulder with a firm, calloused hand and hauled her across the threshold. He swung the door shut with a heavy thud, sliding a thick iron bolt into place. The lock clicked home, sealing them inside as the first heavy, uneven footsteps thumped against the porch steps just inches away. Outside the cabin, the forest floor erupted in a symphony of unnatural movement. Elsa crept toward the wall, pressing her ear to the timber. The sound was not of human boots, but of something dry and disjointed. A rhythmic clicking, metallic and sharp, echoed from multiple directions at once. It was a precise, predatory beat that defied any natural rhythm. She risked a glance through a splintered gap in the wood. In the pale, sickly light of the moon, she saw them. They were husks, skin pulled tight over frames that lacked the fluidity of life. Their gray, translucent flesh seemed to ripple with every shift of their limbs. They moved in a jagged, stuttering motion, their heads tilting in perfect unison as they circled the structure. One stopped directly before the gap, its jaw hanging slack, the clicking sound emanating from the hollow of its throat. It was not a corpse. It was something else entirely, a biological anomaly driven by a singular, relentless hunger. Elsa pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs, as the creature slammed a long, stiff finger against the exterior wall. The wood groaned under the unnatural force, and the clicking intensified into a deafening, frantic chatter that filled the night. Elias stood in the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the cabin's interior before settling on her. He did not ask her name. He did not ask how she had survived the trek through the brush. He simply turned his back and walked to the hearth. Elsa watched him, her breath hitching as she tried to find words, but he cut her off with a sharp, dismissive gesture toward the shadows. He reached into a corner, his grip steady as he pulled a heavy iron fire poker from the soot-stained rack. He moved toward her, his pace measured, and thrust the cold metal toward her chest. She took it. The weight of the iron pulled her shoulder down, grounding her. He did not speak, but his eyes locked onto hers, demanding a focus she had long forgotten. He pointed toward the barricaded windows, then toward the door, then back to her. It was a silent command. No questions were necessary. The threat outside made their pasts irrelevant. Elsa tightened her fingers around the iron, feeling the bite of the metal against her palm. They stood back to back, the space between them closing as the first scrape of a fingernail vibrated against the outer wall. The alliance was set. They were no longer just two people in a room. They were the final line of defense. The last of the daylight bled from the sky, and the forest plunged into absolute black. Then, the scratching started. It began as a tentative, rhythmic tapping against the front wall, then accelerated into a frantic, dissonant chorus. Dozens of fingernails, dry and jagged like needles, raked across the exterior timber. The sound was constant, a shrill, scraping vibration that traveled through the floorboards and up into Elsa's teeth. She pressed her palms against the wood, feeling the walls shudder under the weight of the pressure outside. Elias moved to the window, his posture rigid, watching as the shadows clustered into a singular, shifting mass against the logs. The wood groaned. A splinter popped, flying across the room and landing at Elsa's feet. They were not trying to break the door. They were testing the integrity of every board, searching for a seam to exploit. The scraping intensified, rising to a piercing screech that drowned out the wind. Every corner of the cabin vibrated with the force of their arrival. Dust rained down from the rafters as the structure buckled inward. The siege had begun, and the walls were no longer a barrier, but a temporary cage that was rapidly failing under the relentless, needle-sharp assault of the swarm. The scraping outside fell into a sudden, rhythmic unison. It was no longer a chaotic mess of individual movements, but a calculated, synchronized clicking that echoed the steady beat of a single heart. Elias lowered his rifle, his brow furrowing as he pressed his ear to the timber. The sound shifted from a frantic assault to a low, vibrating thrum that seemed to penetrate the very foundation of the cabin. Elsa watched the gaps between the wall planks. Fingers did not just scratch, they probed, coordinated, and pulled with a singular intent. This was not a mindless pack of predators. It was a hive, a swarm bound by a singular, gnawing emptiness. The hunger they projected did not belong to a living creature. It was colder, more ancient, a void that had outlasted the decay of their own bodies. Every movement against the exterior was directed by a collective consciousness that treated the cabin as a single, edible obstacle. There was no rage in their persistence, only a relentless, mechanical necessity to consume. The air inside the room grew heavy, the temperature dropping as if the swarm were drawing the very warmth from the walls to fuel its insatiable, hollow core. The unity of the swarm broke the silence. A heavy impact struck the north wall, followed by the sound of timber protesting under extreme stress. Elias did not hesitate. He moved to the center of the living room, his boots sliding across the floor as he braced his weight against a support beam. Elsa followed, her movements mirroring his. They worked in a rhythm born of desperate necessity. As a plank near the window bowed inward, Elsa drove a metal wedge into the gap, and Elias slammed a heavy wooden brace against the frame. The cabin buckled. Dust billowed from the ceiling, choking the air. But they did not stop. They shifted their weight with the house, leaning into the structure to counter the pressure from the outside. The walls began to groan, a low, guttural sound of wood fibers snapping. A section of the wall near the corner shuddered, then a long, jagged crack raced down the center of the beam. A board splintered, the end snapping outward with the force of a whip. They were locked in a physical deadlock, two people holding back the weight of a dozen bodies pushing through the wood. The floorboards beneath them creaked, threatening to give way as the swarm intensified its assault. Elias lunged toward the window as the wood gave way completely. He did not aim for the shadows. He fired into the mass of pale, reaching hands. The rifle barked, a thunderous, deafening sound in the confined space. A spray of dark, viscous fluid erupted from the breach, coating the glass and the splintered frame in a thick, oily film. The creatures recoiled, the clicking rhythm faltering as the liquid hit them. Outside, the movement stalled for a heartbeat. Elias cycled the bolt, the metal clicking sharply, and fired again. The second shot tore through a gap in the center of the swarm, scattering the entities back into the fog. The air inside the cabin became thick with the smell of sulfur and wet earth. Elsa gripped the fire poker, her knuckles white, watching the dark droplets slide down the window pane. But the pause was brief. The sound of heavy, uneven footsteps returned, louder than before. More creatures were converging on the cabin, their hunger overriding the fear of the lead. The wood of the window frame groaned again, bowing inward as the weight of the swarm pressed against the glass once more, testing the remaining supports. The window frame finally shattered. Jagged wood sprayed inward, followed immediately by pale, elongated limbs reaching through the gap. Elsa did not retreat. She stepped into the center of the room, the heavy iron fire poker gripped in both hands. She swung. The metal connected with a dull, wet thud against the first reaching hand, snapping the bone instantly. The creature shrieked, a sound like grinding stone, and pulled back. Elsa did not stop. She pivoted on her heel, the poker whistling through the air to strike a second intruder across the shoulder. It was a movement of pure, cold calculation. She felt the vibration travel up her arms, a solid, jarring resistance that proved her strength was sufficient. She swung again, a low arc that caught the edge of a face, forcing the swarm to stumble. The rhythmic impact became her anchor. Each strike followed a precise pattern. Step, rotate, strike, reset. She was no longer just defending, she was clearing space. The iron felt like an extension of her own will, heavy and unyielding. She moved with a speed that startled even Elias, who held his position by the door, watching as she carved a semicircle of empty air around the broken window. For these few seconds, the swarm could not find a way inside. The rhythm of the strikes maintained the perimeter for a dozen breaths. Then, the air shifted. A heavy, cloying scent of stagnant rot poured through the broken window, replacing the smell of wood smoke and dust. It was thick, oily, and metallic. The distinct, pungent odor of decaying flesh left to fester in damp shade. Elsa gagged, the taste of it coating her throat. It was not merely the smell of one creature, it was the concentrated stench of a dozen, pressing their rotting forms directly against the remaining walls. Elias backed away from the door, his eyes darting to the floorboards as the very air in the cabin grew dense and sluggish. The ventilation was gone, choked off by the sheer mass of the swarm outside. Every inhale became a labor, drawing the sickly, sweet, suffocating dampness deep into their lungs. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a sealed box filling with the literal byproduct of the hunt. Elsa dropped the poker for a fleeting second to press her sleeve against her nose, but the scent seeped through the fabric, relentless and invasive. Outside, the clicking sound intensified, a frantic, vibrating chorus that suggested the entities were no longer trying to break in. They were simply waiting for the air inside to become as dead as they were. The walls began to groan. It was a deep, resonant sound, like the keel of a ship snapping under a crushing depth. The logs were no longer stationary. They were bowing inward, the thick timber fibers protesting against the relentless pressure from outside. Dozens of bodies were packed against the exterior, their combined weight turning the cabin into a pressure chamber. Elsa watched a single, thick support beam near the ceiling begin to crack. A spiderweb of fractures raced across the grain, shedding splinters that rained down onto the floorboards. The entire house shuddered. Every time the swarm shifted their mass, the floor joists beneath their feet gave a sharp, agonizing screech of metal nails pulling loose from rotting wood. The ceiling light flickered, then died, plunging the room into a dim, gray gloom. Elias planted his feet wide, bracing his shoulder against a central pillar, but the wood beneath his palm felt soft, spongy, and utterly compromised. The rhythm of the clicking outside stopped, replaced by a heavy, unified thudding against the exterior walls. The house did not just tremble, it began to tilt. The structural integrity was failing, the very foundation of their sanctuary bending until the joints screamed. The cabin was reaching its limit, and the walls were no longer a barrier. They were a cage about to burst. Elias lunged across the buckling floorboards, his hand outstretched toward the heavy iron ring of the cellar hatch. "Get down there," he shouted, his voice cracking against the roar of the splintering timber. Elsa scrambled behind him, her boots slipping on the debris that now littered the center of the room. She reached the trapdoor just as Elias shoved his weight against it, but the wood did not budge. He heaved again, veins bulging in his neck, yet the hatch remained fused to the frame. A spray of black, viscous fluid erupted from the floorboards nearby, followed by the sound of something heavy and jagged gnawing at the underside of the floor. The cellar was not a refuge, it was a tomb. The mechanisms had been compromised from beneath, the hinges rusted through and jammed by the very things they were trying to escape. Elias dropped to his knees, clawing at the wood until his fingers bled. But the door was dead weight. He looked up at Elsa, his face pale, and said in a hard, grim line, "They were pinned." The floor beneath them shuddered as the house groaned, and in that pulse of silence between the structural screams, they realized they had nowhere left to run. The silence in the room became absolute. The thudding against the exterior stopped, leaving only the sound of their own ragged breathing. Elsa stared at the wall. The rough-hewn logs were no longer solid. They were being picked apart from the outside, stripped away splinter by splinter. Then, the first pinprick of light appeared. It was not the warm glow of a lantern or the harsh white of the moon. It was a sickly, bioluminescent pulse. Faint at first, then growing in intensity. Through a jagged crack in the timber, a milky, translucent orb pressed forward. It was an eye, devoid of pupil or iris, glowing with a cold, pale light that cast long, distorted shadows across the floorboards. Then a second appeared, then a third, scattered like stars across the darkening wall. They were watching. The creatures were not just tearing at the wood, they were observing the prey inside. Elsa backed away, her heel catching on a stray fragment of debris. She watched as more holes opened, each one revealing another glowing orb, all of them fixed on the center of the room. The cabin was bleeding light. The walls were becoming transparent, a fragile membrane about to be pierced. Elias stood motionless, his gaze locked onto the shifting, luminescent swarm gathering just inches away. The breach was no longer coming. It was already here. The wood surrendered. A deep, resonant groan vibrated through the floorboards, followed by the sharp, rhythmic crack of timber snapping under immense weight. The wall did not just break, it detonated. Splinters flew like shrapnel, slicing through the air as the massive logs buckled inward. Dust, dry rot, and cold night air rushed into the room in a single, suffocating wave. Then, the intruders poured through the gap. They surged over the broken threshold in a tangled, gray mass, their movements erratic and twitching. The living room instantly transformed from a sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. Elsa fell back against the kitchen counter, the iron fire poker gripped white-knuckled in her hand. She watched as the first of the creatures cleared the debris, its limbs moving with an unnatural, clicking gait. There was no hesitation in their advance. They swarmed over the shattered furniture, their milky eyes fixed on the center of the room. The air grew heavy with the metallic tang of decay and the wet, rhythmic sound of their breathing. Chaos erupted as the floorboards groaned under the sudden, combined weight of the horde. Elias moved, his shadow casting long against the wall, but he was already being pushed back by the sheer volume of the encroaching wall of bodies. The battle had begun. Elias did not retreat. He lunged into the center of the surge, his boots sliding through the debris and spilled rot. He held his knife low, a short, silver blade that caught the faint light with every arc. He didn't swing wide. He stabbed with precision, targeting the joints where the gray husks moved with unnatural rigidity. The first creature lunged, its jaw unhinging, but Elias stepped inside its reach, driving the steel into its throat. It crumpled, creating a momentary tripwire for the two behind it. He moved like a man half his age, his breathing rhythmic and controlled despite the chaos. He slashed at the swarm, forcing them to recoil as he cleared a small, desperate circle around him. His arm was a blur of motion. Every strike found a target, tearing through the thick, cold flesh. He threw his weight into a shoulder charge, slamming into the chest of the largest intruder and sending it reeling backward into its own kind. The pressure against them eased for a heartbeat. He turned his head, shouting for Elsa to keep moving, his eyes hard and focused on the wall of bodies ahead. He was the only thing holding the line, a single, defiant point of resistance against an ocean of decay. He stepped forward again, his knife flashing, carving a path through the throng. The momentum shifted in a heartbeat. Elias pivoted for another strike, but the floorboards beneath him gave way, dropping him into a shallow depression. He was off balance for a fraction of a second, and that was all the creatures needed. Three of the husks lunged at once, slamming into him with enough force to rattle the remaining wall studs. He drove his knife into the chest of the nearest one, but the blade stuck, wedged deep in the calcified ribs. He tugged, heaved, and cursed, but the steel was locked. The veteran was suddenly anchored. The swarm sensed the opening and swarmed over his shoulders, their cold, dry fingers digging into his skin. He fought with his free hand, hammering his fist into the faces of the nearest intruders, but more kept climbing over them. The weight was relentless. He was pushed backward, his heels sliding through the debris as the creatures piled on top of him. He struggled to rise, his legs buckling under the crushing mass of bodies. His face turned toward the ceiling, teeth gritted, as he was slowly dragged down into the center of the writhing gray pile. The light in his eyes flickered, but he continued to claw at the floor, his fingers scraping deep gouges into the wood in a final, desperate attempt to hold his ground. Then, he disappeared beneath the swarm. Elsa did not hesitate. She saw the veteran disappear under the gray tide and lunged forward, discarding the fire poker to free her hands. She gripped the back of his coat, her fingers locking into the fabric, and planted her boots against the splintered floorboards. The weight was immense. It felt like trying to pull a stone from a riverbed. She heaved, her muscles straining until her joints burned, but the creatures held tight. One of the husks turned, its milky eyes fixing on her, and it clawed at her arm, tearing through the air near her throat. She ignored the pain, hooked her other hand into the veteran's collar, and put every ounce of her remaining strength into a single, violent backward tug. The floor groaned. A section of the wall buckled outward under the pressure of the pile. With a sickening sound of rending fabric, Elias slid free from the center of the swarm. Elsa stumbled back, hauling him into the small space she had cleared. He was gasping, his chest heaving, but he was breathing. The cabin shuddered as if the building itself were exhaling. The swarm surged again, sensing their prey had shifted, but they were a second too late. The wall behind them finally gave way, opening a jagged, splintered maw to the freezing night outside. The night air hit them like a physical blow, freezing and sharp. Elsa did not look back at the splintered ruin of the cabin. She surged through the gap, her boots finding only uneven, mud-slicked earth. Elias stumbled beside her, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The silence of the forest was absolute, a stark contrast to the chaotic scraping of the swarm they had just left behind. They moved blindly. The darkness was so thick it felt like a heavy curtain pressing against their faces. Elsa reached out, her hands scraping against wet tree bark as she tried to navigate the tangled undergrowth. Every step was a gamble. Her foot caught on a protruding root, and she went down, dragging Elias with her into the cold, damp leaves. They hit the ground hard, the impact jarring their bones. They scrambled to stand, limbs trembling, and pushed deeper into the trees. Behind them, the sounds of the cabin began to change, the rhythmic clicking of the creatures growing louder, more erratic. They did not speak. They did not stop. They turned their backs on the flickering remains of the cabin and plunged into the absolute, suffocating void of the forest floor, seeking a path that was not there. They ran until the air in their lungs turned to needles. Elsa could feel the rhythm of her own heart hammering against her ribs. A frantic, uneven beat that synced with the clicking sounds now echoing from the trees behind them. It was a dry, insectal noise, the sound of chitin scraping against bark. Getting closer with every stride, Elias moved with a grim, limping intensity, his hand occasionally brushing against Elsa to keep them together. They crashed through a dense thicket of brambles, the thorns tearing at their skin, but neither slowed. The forest floor was treacherous, a carpet of rot that shifted beneath their weight. Elsa stumbled over a hidden depression, her knees slamming into the earth. But she surged back to her feet before she had even fully stopped moving. The clicking grew louder, a chorus of hunger closing the distance. They sprinted harder, their boots pounding rhythmically against the damp soil, driven by the sheer terror of the sound at their backs. Sweat cooled on their skin, turning to ice in the night air. Their chest muscles burned with every inhale, but they pushed on, plunging deeper into the black expanse, knowing that to stop for even a single breath would mean the end. The forest was a mirror designed to deceive. Elsa stopped, her hand finding a jagged, familiar scar on the trunk of a massive pine. She had touched that same scar 3 minutes ago. They were not moving forward. They were tracing the edges of the cage. The trees stood like iron bars, their branches weaving a canopy that choked out any hope of starlight. Every shadow stretched toward them, elongating in the dim, gray mist until it seemed the darkness itself had intent. Elias panted, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the gloom for a break that never came. The clicking behind them had paused, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Elsa spun, looking for a path, but the trunk shifted in the periphery of her vision. Every direction looked exactly like the one they had just fled. The air grew stagnant, heavy with the scent of damp moss and impending finality. She grabbed Elias by the arm, pulling him toward a patch of shadow that looked slightly thinner. But as they moved, the trees seemed to close ranks. The forest was no longer just a place. It was a predator that knew exactly how to break their resolve before it moved in for the kill. The trees finally thinned, snapping the suffocating grip of the woods. Elsa stumbled, her momentum carrying her toward a sudden, jagged drop-off. She caught her balance inches from the edge, her boots scattering loose shale into the void. Below, The earth had split open, revealing a deep, narrow ravine carved by a black, swirling creek. The water moved with a sluggish, viscous rhythm, reflecting nothing but the absolute absence of light. Elias caught up, his breath rattling in his throat as he peered down into the dark abyss. There was no way around. The walls were sheer, slick with moisture, and impossibly steep. They scanned the rim, searching for a path, and then they saw it. A single, rotted log lay stretched across the gap, its surface moss covered and sagging under its own weight. It looked brittle, barely holding its position against the slow erosion of the creek below. It was a bridge to nowhere, yet it remained the only physical possibility of escape. They approached the edge, the ground beneath them trembling slightly from the distant, rhythmic thud of the encroaching mortar. The log groaned as the wind caught it, a hollow, splintering sound that echoed through the chasm. This was the end of the line, and the only path forward was a gamble against gravity. Elsa tested the wood with the toe of her boot. It gave a sickening, wet crunch, but held. She took the first step, her arms out to balance against the freezing updraft from the creek. Elias followed, his grip firm on her shoulder. They moved in silence, every muscle locked against the sway of the rotted timber. Then, the sound began. It started as a low, grating vibration behind them, then erupted into a collective, discordant moan that tore through the mist. It was a sound of absolute, hollow hunger. The creatures surged to the edge of the ravine, a sea of gray movement that blocked out the sky. The moaning reached a deafening, piercing pitch, vibrating in Elsa's very marrow. She did not look back. She could feel the heat of the horde at her heels, the clicking of teeth rhythmic and fast, like rain on a tin roof. The log swayed violently as the creatures pressed against the bank, their weight shaking the very foundations of the ravine. Elsa reached the center, the wood bowing beneath her, water churning black and hungry 20 feet below. She fixed her eyes on the far bank, ignoring the screams, forcing her feet to move, one agonizing inch at a time, while the chasm roared with the sound of the dead. Elsa scrambled onto the dirt of the far bank, her hands clawing at roots to pull herself clear. She rolled, gasping, and reached back to haul Elias up. He landed hard beside her, his chest heaving, but he did not stop to rest. He turned instantly toward the log. The creatures were already crowding the opposite edge, the wood groaning as the first of them tested the crossing. Elias saw the danger immediately. He lunged back toward the ravine edge, ignoring the spray of mud and the rising, screeching wall of sound. He found a heavy, jagged rock embedded in the bank and swung it with everything he had. The first blow struck the log near its anchor point, sending a shower of wet splinters into the air. The creatures surged, teeth clicking, reaching out with frantic, grasping limbs. Elias swung again, his rhythm brutal and precise. The log cracked. A third blow shattered the remaining, rotted fibers. With a final, sickening snap, the wood gave way. It tumbled into the darkness of the ravine, taking 3 of the lead creatures with it. The remaining horde pulled back from the edge, their collective moan shifting into a low, baffled vibration. Silence rushed in to fill the void, heavy and absolute, as the path behind them vanished into the black. They lay on the damp earth, limbs heavy, breath rattling in their throats. The silence of the forest was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, pressing against their ears. Across the gap, the shadows did not vanish. They stood at the edge of the ravine, motionless, their forms flickering like heat haze against the dark trees. Elsa wiped dirt from her forehead, her fingers trembling against her skin. She watched the creatures. They were not leaving. They were waiting. The mist curled around their still figures, blurring the lines between the living and the hollowed remains. Elias sat up, his back against a thick oak, his gaze fixed on the opposite bank. He did not speak. The threat had not been destroyed, only delayed. A sense of profound, stagnant unease settled over the clearing. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp moss and something metallic. Every nerve in Elsa's body remained coiled, expecting the clicking to start again at any second. The forest watched them back, its ancient patience unbroken by their struggle. They were safe for the moment, but the woods were a cage, and the lock had only just been set. The shadows began to recede into the deeper fog, fading into the eternal gloom of the trees, leaving them in a silence that felt heavier than the screams. Minutes stretched into hours, yet the sky remained a bruised, unmoving black. Elsa kept her eyes fixed on the eastern horizon, waiting for the first gray sliver of dawn, but the light never came. The forest canopy held the darkness tight, refusing to yield even a single degree of clarity. Beside her, the ground felt damp, leaching the heat from her body as she sat motionless. The air grew stagnant, tasting of wet earth and slow decay. She looked at her hands, then at the trees, noting how the shadows seemed to bleed into one another until the path they had traveled was gone. The distinction between the living and the hollowed-out husks felt increasingly fragile. Survival was no longer about moving forward. It was a slow, deliberate endurance against an environment that refused to reset. Elias shifted, his movements stiff, his breathing shallow and rhythmic. He did not look for the sun. He knew what she was only beginning to grasp. The boundary between their own existence and the forest collection of lost souls was thinning with every passing pulse. They were not just hiding, they were being absorbed. The forest did not need to hunt them down. It simply waited for their resolve to fray, for their rhythm to match the static, breathless silence of the trees. The sky remained fixed in a permanent, starless void. Elsa stopped fighting the urge to check the time. The passage of minutes had lost all meaning in the dark. She leaned back against the rough bark of a pine, feeling the tree pulse with a slow, rhythmic vibration that matched her own heartbeat. The forest was not merely a location. It was a singular, breathing consciousness. Every branch seemed to angle toward them, every shadow deepening to obscure the way they had come. Elias closed his eyes, his breathing shallow, his presence fading into the textures of the woods. He had stopped resisting. He had become part of the scenery. Elsa reached out, her fingers brushing the damp, moss-covered ground, and felt the earth pull at her skin. The hunger of the forest was not a sudden strike. It was a gradual, patient assimilation. It waited for the mind to tire and the will to dissolve. Above, the canopy knit itself tighter, locking the darkness in place. They were no longer refugees of a broken life. They were artifacts in a collection that spanned centuries. The clicking resumed in the distance, a low, rhythmic sound that echoed the forest's own pulse. It was not hunting them anymore. It was welcoming them. The trees stood still, the shadows watched, and the forest continued its eternal, silent vigil.